We have 20 minutes for some questions. That's all that's keeping us from coffee. So has anyone, would anyone like to start us off, please?
Question for Alessandra.
Christian.
Alessandra, may I ask you sort of one detail about what you said? You talked about an edition of Bartolus, I think it was, which was only the commentary with lemata, not the whole text.
The commentary to the constitutions, you mean? Well, I found it really interesting, this.
Could I ask you, to what extent can we say something about how that fits in with the availability of other texts? Because if you only have the commentary and the lemata, it actually doesn't make much sense unless you have access to the whole text.
That's very interesting.
So if you have the commentary on Aristotle with the lemata, you need to have the whole text in order to make sense of it. But you might well be in a place where you have access to the whole of Aristotle, and you could use them side by side to refresh your memory if you've forgotten what the whole text means. You may have learned it by heart. But how does that work with a legal text? Would you expect people to have had the whole text in a printed form? Is it distributed in such a way that the distribution matches the existence of manuscript texts? How's the interaction between the lemata, commentary lemata, and the whole text?
I think that a legal historian would be provide you with a better answer, but possibly we as book historians will find more elements to add to what is known already. It was called Bartolismo because the text was, the insight to the text was provided by his interpretation. So his interpretation was standing alone. And I think they have all the books because the books provided reference within the commentary and then the interpretation of it. This is what the school of commentators was. And why it was different from the glossator. The glossator provided the glossa, so the comment to the text, which goes around the text. While the commentators provided a more insight and interpretation, also according to the current needs, also political needs. And in fact, Bartolus became quite famous, also is famous in England, for treatises on political side, like the De Tiranno, or treatises like this. So interpretation of the Roman law, but applied to the current situation. To know whether the students had both the corpus and the text to read the corpus, I would say yes. I'm not sure that the students have, certainly the jurists have both. What I found it interesting in the Constitutiones Extravagantes, as you can see there, this shift from the glossa. In that case, the extravagantes are an addition to the corpus that came after, and the commentary goes like the glossa, but then it was also a treatise. He produces an autonomous treatise based on it. In this case, you have the text of the Roman law at the beginning as an introduction, and then the treatise follows. But I must say, I think an entire census also of the manuscript would be worth doing to see how they change from the 14th to 15th century especially. And actually I've been in the reading room of the manuscript at the British Library where I found some very interesting cases in the Arundel collection. One of them I didn't have the time to show you today, but I've seen them, the addition of another contemporary jurist, Alessandro Tartagni, who was famous to produce his addition to Bartolus. And there is an edition where, printed in Mantua, of Bartolus' commentary to the Codex, three last book of the Codex. This copy in Mantua has only additions of another jurist, previous one, and apart, printed the Additiones of Tartagni. In this manuscript at the Brielle, you have exactly the same situation, only you can see that the additions are just made, added to the manuscript. So I think it's a kind of photography, image of what was happening in the 1470s. So I think to provide you with a more in-depth and refined and complete answer, I like to talk more to legal historians, of course, and to read more, but I'm pretty certain that commentatori means this, means that they provided an insight to the text, without the text already, at least for the beginning of the study. And I think we would like to have a census of all manuscripts, existing manuscripts, for the university at least.
More work is needed.
Yeah.
Graham.
Hello, Graham Child. I've spent my life as an English lawyer, practicing and then teaching English law. English lawyers, English legal system has always rejected as much as possible corpus juris and continental influences, although it has to be said that in the universities a great deal of attention has been paid to it, but it just shows the British or English difference between practicing law and academic law. Even now, I mean, I was a student in Oxford and I had to study these things that you've been referring to, and even now it is part of an undergraduate English Oxford law course to study Justinian. I was intrigued that there are so many copies in the UK, or at least in England. I would have expected actually to be more in Scotland, but I just wonder whether you could comment on just how quite so many copies come to be in the UK.
It appears that they studied it because, as I said, and jurists like legal historians like Bellomo has showed, they studied them because they didn't apply immediately that law. You couldn't apply that law immediately. You need to interpret it anyway. But it provided a framework. I mean, the local rules, also in Italy, the statutes, wouldn't be written without this frame, the rationale which was behind the law. It appears that still in the UK it was in use, especially canon law, I must say. But if you go in Oxford, I've seen copies of Corpus Christi, St. John, a New College, St. Magdalene, but they are all, in every college, you have these books bought when they was printed. And they have notes on them, and they have the notes sometimes from the founder of the colleges, and they were clearly using them. The question is, maybe they stopped using them as a main text at the beginning of the 17th century, the end of the 16th century, beginning of 17th century. But I'd like to have more sources on this before.
Good. Thank you. Falk.
Thank you all. Thanks, especially if I may say to Christian for what I think is a sort of very door-opening paper. I think there's an English saying, there's an elephant in the room, is that right?
Yes.
And I'm afraid, Christian, you have just opened the door for this elephant to enter our party here, and I think it has to do with what was before and outside Bodleian Library Catalogue and as concerns provenance research, because as I'm sure we all know, there have been decades of provenance research that were printed in this old-fashioned or published in this old-fashioned medium, the printed book, and are not available or only hardly available as online data. I am, of course, referring to the many catalogs that had been published in Germany, but also in France and elsewhere. And I mean, my question is just because you said the abundance of evidence shouldn't keep us from working with it, but how do you think could we do that, work with this much evidence that is already available and integrate it into projects such as May, which is, in my point of view, even though I know it is very boring to do just retro conversion and then recheck the data, but that is such an enormous amount of data that the next 3 ERC grants will not be sufficient to dig it up again. You just need to retro convert, or what the English word for it is. So that would be something that's really directed at everybody here in the room, including the elephant.
Thank you very much, Falk. Yes, of course, there's been an enormous amount of provenance work. You can find provenance information back in 18th century sale catalogues. So there's absolutely no doubt about that. I think what I was trying to suggest was a level of documentation and a level of a systematic approach, which I think was what I was trying to achieve in the Bodleian Library catalogue, where equal weight was being given to all types of evidence, and where information was provided which would enable others to challenge our information. So basically making it part of normal academic discourse, where you state something, say why you state it, so other people can say, oh no, you're wrong. It's only if you give your footnotes and your references that you enable other people to engage in detail with it. Of course, other people have done that before, but I wanted to do that in a systematic way. I think that there are a number of answers to you. There's no such thing as perfection, which I think is an important thing to remember when you deal with vast amount of material. And I think, in a sense, this is not big data in a modern sense of the word, but it's still a lot of material. Believing that you can document everything, that you must see everything before you make a statement, will mean that you probably never say anything. So I think that beginning with what's available is a good idea. We've got an awful lot of information in May. We've got an awful lot of information gathered together in Paul Needham's aggregation of published information, where Paul has relied on a lot of those published catalogues you refer to. And where Paul has obviously had to rely on the published information occasionally, obviously saying, oh, this must be nonsense. I remember Paul and I discussing a piece of information in the catalogue of Indianapolis from the Royal Library in Copenhagen, which had put it down, a book down to being owned by Cistercians in Braunschweig in the 17th century. Probably wrong, and indeed it was a misreading, I remember. So yes, Paul has engaged critically with it, but within limits of the possibility, much more sensibly, he has made the information available. And that, I suppose, is where we increasingly can rely on tools being developed which will enable people to pull information together from various types of resources without ensuring uniformity, but having sufficient similarity for our systems to bring information together so we can see it more or less side by side. Manual work will never be superseded, though.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Perhaps Paul Needham would.
Just sort of like to make what you might call a half-hearted defense of the word revolution, imprinting revolution. And that would just be on the basis, first, that the way the word revolution is used in English is so broad that in a way you have to acknowledge the broadness of saying something like scientific revolution, and you don't have everybody just saying, oh, total nonsense. Although, when are we talking about? A period of 150 years or even more, when you can take Copernicus as a beginning point, you can also push him back to it is an open-ended term. And the one thing when you said about intentionality as being a sort of a definer of what a revolution is, there is an intention, I thought it was a fascinating point. But then it occurred to me, and I do think it's a fascinating point, and one should take that into account. But of course, the revolution par excellence is the French Revolution. And if you sort of say, the French Revolution was no revolution, then there was almost nothing as a revolution. But you could say, well, about the first 3 years of that was an attempt to form a constitutional monarchy. So, at what point does intention come in? And I believe historians of the French Revolution have, in fact, sort of various arguments were the various bourgeois publicists were they pretending they would accept a constitutional monarchy, but secretly behind the scenes they knew that wouldn't work? Anyhow, I'm just trying to say that intentionality itself is a difficult concept to pin down.
I think in one level I can say I fundamentally disagree with you, which is that I do think that we should discuss terms like this. I sort of agree with 16th century and earlier lawyers that the significatio verborum is important. We do need to know what the words which we use actually mean, and engaging into a discussion about what they mean is important. So therefore, in one sense, I fundamentally disagree with you. Yes, we do need to discuss the terms, and therefore I fundamentally also agree with you, because you do engage with me in the meaning, in discussion of the meaning of the word. And it's by having that sort of this, engagement with what does this word actually mean, that we get to find out what is it we mean by using it.
Perhaps that's a good note to end on. Questions of intentionality and coffee tend to go together. Could we thank our panel once more, please, for 3 excellent papers?